today's presentation actually is more than just this book. It's sort of going to be a summary of the whole quarter, capped off with some thoughts about the book. And I do this every quarter, basically. So a lot of these slides, the main point is basically the same. Some of the stuff in it, I'm going to like sort of gloss over because they were relevant to specific other quarters. But we'll just see how it goes. Okay, so the quarter, we started off with basically 2 or 3 different threads. One of them was just the idea of interactive media and what's interactive media, what's a game, and all that stuff. You know, what's ergodic literature. Another one was looking at basically like internet culture or web culture and like algorithms and surveillance and privacy and all these sorts of issues that have sort of come up in the last 10 years or so, 5 to 10 years, and how that has sort of shaped us as people and all that stuff. Another thing that we sort of touched on was I guess this concept of bad actors on the net, people creating fake news and trying to manipulate other people and stuff, basically using the net and motivations for that. Some of it's political, some of it's just monetary, and trying to tie all these things together and end with sort of a high note is what the purpose of this book was for this one reading. So let's start with the interactive media. What is interactive media? We had 2 readings on this, basically. One of them was this guy, Espen Arseth, wrote this book, Cybertext, and this concept of ergodic literature, where this is basically the crux of it is non-trivial effort is required to traverse the text. Whether Arseth try to differentiate if that effort was physical or mental is kind of unclear, I feel like. But one of the things that we sort of talked about is I guess that it's more than just automatic reading, and that this idea of non-trivial effort could be tied to having the reader make decisions as they're reading, or make their brain work in a way that's not just scanning text. And so part of that is making decisions, and then that is often exhibited by some sort of physical manifestation. So like if you're manipulating a pop-up book, for example, or you're solving a puzzle or something like that, and the puzzle happens to have writing on it, and so you're actually piecing together the text by solving the puzzle and all that stuff. So that requires both physical and mental effort, right? But the important part of it is that I think that your brain is doing some sort of decision making, and putting pieces together and everything. We also had this guy, Brian Upton, who talked about basically what does interactive actually even mean. And I like this reading because he sort of breaks down a whole bunch of sort of like, he starts off a really simple model and then makes it more and more complex as you read through the chapter. And the very basic definition of something that's interactive is that you basically have 2 things that are talking to each other, and when one does one thing, the other one reacts in some way, and then the first one reacts to the second one who just reacted to them, right? So they're having this continuous sort of back and forth reaction to previous actions, and what that means is that it's not one way. Like it isn't just one person. Like it's not like you listening to a podcast where the person who's doing the podcast is just he or she is just saying something, and they're not reacting to how you're reacting to them, right? So that's not interactive. Whereas something like a video game is interactive because the game reacts to your input, but you're actually also reacting to the game and what it's presenting to you. So that loop is interaction. The nice thing about Upton is that he breaks down into a whole bunch of different, more complex areas, I guess, and it overlaps with this idea of ergodic literature nicely in the sense that some of the interaction, if you think about like the current, if you take a snapshot in time, I guess, of the interaction, you have like a state. Um, the whole model, the whole interaction system is in some sort of static state, right? But there's a whole bunch of those added together form a narrative, and all the different states that it could be in are determined by all these different constraints that could be at play at any moment. And some of those constraints are things that are deliberately sort of like almost like physical things that are in the way that can constrain you in certain ways. But then some of the constraints are purely imaginary, on the person, in the person's head and everything. And I think of that as a good way of sort of thinking about the ergodic literature part of it is just thinking about how, as you're reading an interactive story or whatever, or playing a video game or whatever it is, you are constrained by, both your physical limitations and everything, but also just how you think about it, what kind of knowledge you have, or about the thing that you're doing, or the context or whatever it is. And so the heavy lifting, I think, in both of these sorts of models is your brain, and how you are sort of like thinking about the future, like some sort of possible future state, and working towards that. And all of that requires, basically thinking, right? Imagining. So after hearing all that, what is a game then? So a game is sort of like a subset, I guess, of interactive media. And somebody's mic is on, and we got feedback. But basically, if we, I guess, rewind time a little bit, there's been like 100 years or so of people trying to define what games are. And this guy, Jesper Yule, wrote this paper on the game The Player of the World, and basically looking at 100 years of people writing about what games are, and looking at the common things about all of them, and creating a matrix, and then coming up with like, okay, so if we look at all these people and we sort of mash them all together, this is the actual definition of a game. And it's very formalized. It's very like, a game has rules, a game has a goal, a game has some sort of conflict, or something gets in your way, some obstacle exists to prevent you from getting to the goal, so you have to overcome those obstacles in order to get to the goal, stuff like that, right? And then people like me came along and offered up alternative definition for what games are, which includes more of a, I guess, a humanistic or anthropological look at meaning making in games, and how games become meaningful, and that games are actually instantiations of meaning making with some sort of narrative. And so to play a game then is about making meaningful decisions within some sort of narrative space. And so in order to make meaningful decisions, you have to understand the game well enough. You have to understand the systems and all that stuff. And basically, to use Upton's language, you have to understand the constraints that are at play, so that you can make strategic decisions, right? When you're making those strategic decisions, they are by definition meaningful decisions, because you're able to strategize about them. You're able to, they become something that's meaningful for you. Like you have placed values and goals, or values, I guess, and attitudes on the certain moves that you could be making. This move is better than prefer to this move because I want to make the game go in this direction, so that becomes a meaningful decision. But then you also make meaning in terms of you make connections with like the story and the people that are in the games or whatever, the characters and everything, and that sort of empathy layer of relating to what's going on in the game um, is really important, I think, too. And you derive meaning from that in a way that's more than like this sort of mechanical movement through a space that like Jesper Yule sort of describes games as. And then, we had this guy, Ian Bogost, who said gamification is bullshit. But the important part of that week was this video where he gave a talk at a user research summit, basically, on games and finding fun in games. And his main argument was that fun is found in treating games as basically systems or puzzles that you have to sort of unravel in order to be able to deal with them. And I found this really I guess transformational in the sense that I started applying this to non-games and thinking about like systems that we have to deal with in life. And if you can realize, I guess, that you occupy a bunch of different oppressive systems, you can take a gameful approach to them and realize that there are different strategies that you can employ in order to understand how those systems work and everything, and make it maybe not enjoyable or maybe not fun, but at least approach it in a way that is gameful, right? But Ian Bogos would argue that it is fun. Like you when figuring out how a system works, recognizing patterns within noise is fun. He relies on this guy, Bernard Sweets, who wrote Gaming is a Voluntary Attempt to Overcome Unnecessary Obstacles. And this is just to reiterate the point that like so there's these systems that we have created, that we have imposed on ourselves, and they're dumb, they're wretched, and yet we partake in them when it's a game because we realize that they're just these challenges that we have arbitrarily sort of decided upon, and figuring out how to overcome those challenges is what makes them fun, right? Like playing golf by hitting the ball with a stick instead of just like walking over to the hole and dropping the ball in the hole, right? So the important part of this is that it's voluntary. And so like if you were to look at life systems like I was just talking about, like let's say you're dealing with trying to get an emergency passport so that you can go to another country because you didn't realize that like passports don't count if they expire 3 months from now, even though they fucking expire 3 months from now. But having to do that is not voluntary, right? But I think what Bogos was talking about is that if you view that system and then realize how dumb it is, and then just say, well, fuck it, I'm just going to do it. You can frame it as a voluntary election of participating in the dumb system. So even though you have to do it, you can sort of pretend you don't have to do it and you're doing it anyways, and then it becomes like something that's actually bearable. So that's my takeaway from these things. So okay, games are these systems to sort of unravel and unpack and everything, and if you approach life that way, you can you can make life a little bit more bearable, right? So unfortunately, there's a whole bunch of problems within gaming, and also within like these, I guess, these systems that we have created for us to participate in life, right? And one of the issues, I think one of the big issues that I would try to get across this quarter is that there's power in how people portray things and the rhetoric we use to describe things. Um, and so, a lot of the traction, I think, from fake news and stuff is how it's presented. Um, it has the trappings of like real news, and so it's easy to be fooled because it looks real, right? But then, um, depending on who's saying it, or how charismatic they are, or whatever, um, or how they even just sort of like use turns of phrases or certain words to describe certain things, can be convincing for some people, right? If you just think about like how Trump talks, um, it's kind of crazy to think this, but there's a whole bunch of people who like buy into that shit, right? Um, and um, Another example of this is gamification, or Ian Bogo's sort of argument about gamification, where you just add points to something and call it a game. So his main beef about that is just that, and I didn't mean to make that pun, but it's just that he feels like it's fooling people into thinking something is fun when it actually isn't fun, because what real fun is that you're dealing with this wretched system and you're figuring out how to deal with it, right? And so calling this thing a game just because you throw points on it, is a mislabeling of the activity, and that's the thing that he has most issue with. I mean, he actually does have issues with the actual reward system also, but his biggest issue is just like calling it a game, um and you can extend this. There's to fake news. Fake news is basically calling something that isn't news. um and like, how do we deal with that, right? How do we get out of this situation that we're in, this mess that we're in? Well, first off, it guys it kind of requires understanding that it exists and how it comes about. And so that's sort of what we concentrated on this quarter, I feel like. And there are certain techniques that you can use as like an individual to try to, you know, identify it and not fall for it and everything. But in terms of a larger systemic change that we need to be making, this class didn't actually provide very many answers to that. I feel like this class was mostly an introduction to here's a whole bunch of issues. But um, so that's one of the issues that we had to deal with. One of the things that used to be in the syllabus that isn't right now is about violence in games. And it's funny because like I normally don't put this in this course because it's such a dead horse issue. Um, it's basically been shown over and over again that there isn't um, very strong evidence that violence in video games make people more violent or anything like that. It increases aggression levels in some cases, but it's not lasting, and there's no proof that like you become a violent person by playing violent games your whole life or anything like that. In fact, there's a lot of evidence on the contrary, where if you just look at graphs from the last 20 years or so, games have gotten way more popular in the last 20 years. Violent crime has gone down in the last 20 years. So like those two things are inverse correlated already. But I threw this in basically 2 years ago after Parkland shooting, because the Trump administration was making the argument that it was because of violent video games. And they actually put out a video on YouTube, showing how violent video games are, and basically saying that, we need to get rid of violent video games instead of like, gun control or anything like that. Right. Um, so that's what this whole thing is about. It's no longer in the syllabus, but I might have to throw it in there again every time we have a shooting, which, as soon as the pandemic's over, it's going to happen again, right? So um, it might be in here again someday, some quarter, which is really sad. I was going to skip that. So this video was thrown into the first week. It was just like an optional thing to watch. It used to actually be front and center in one of the weeks. You should watch it if you haven't watched it, and then gets totally pissed off at it because it's making the argument that um, using your smartphone is making you dumber, basically, and that you're losing out on real life by spending your time using your smartphone instead. And um, it's dumb because, or I feel like it's not really portraying things in a legit way, because it doesn't take into account that often when you are on your smartphone you are actually socializing. And so um, um, it's not like you're being antisocial. You actually are talking to other people. It's just that you're talking to them through your phone instead of like face to face. And like the reason why I threw this not as front and center anymore as one of the main readings is because like we're in pandemic time. So like no shit, right? So like we talk to each other through our digital devices now, and it's just normal now. And I feel like from now on it's just like, well, yeah, okay, this is normal now. Um, so anyways, there's that. It's a fun video to watch though, because you can get really pissed off at it. It's basically white white privilege problems. Rich white Londoners, um, and their issues with digital social media. Um, okay, so we get into the heart of the actual issues I think that exists on the net now. Like there is a lot of data about us online, and it's being used to track us, to market to us, and also to manipulate us. Um, there's a whole bunch of different ways it manifests. One of them is the Cambridge Analytica story that came out, after the election in 2016. And it's still ongoing because it's not like that the techniques that they use have gone away. The people who formed Cambridge Analytica, even though it went bankrupt, are still in business. They're just under a different name, and they're still doing the same thing. It's just for different people now and everything, right? And if you look at the elections in like the Philippines and India and stuff like that, they've had a hand in or companies who do similar things, if not them, have had a hand in basically trying to manipulate people in voting a certain way or whatever, through like as a reminder, it's basically through you have a ton of data about you on Facebook, and from the constellation of things that you've liked, people can actually kind of tell uh, what demographic you fall under, what your political preferences are. Um, they can map on a personality to you from the Ocean personality test. And um, it isn't 100% accurate, but it doesn't need to be, because we're talking with millions of people. And so it's more accurate than it isn't. And so that is enough for them to be able to nudge things a certain way, right? So then when they've identified certain demographic pockets of or subgroups of people under a certain demographic, they can target those people with very specific ads that they know will sort of convince or push or nudge if someone's on the fence or whatever, because they're susceptible to certain types of messaging and everything. So that's what the whole scandal is about and everything, and it's still an issue. We also have other sorts of issues related to big data, where like the last week we had readings on surveillance capitalism, basically, and um, um, all of this stuff out there about us to basically, Zuboff's claim is that it basically short circuit the whole capitalist model, in that instead of us determining that we need something and we go out to the free market and acquire that thing and then buy it from some supplier who's just operating that free market, that whole model is being short circuited, because we are being manipulated into thinking we need certain things. And so it's no longer us determining whether we need it. It's actually these companies that are determining whether we need it, and then sort of manipulating us in going out and buying certain products and everything, right? And then tracking us and following us and targeting us with ads and all that stuff. It's it's basically bullshit. We shouldn't be putting up with it, right? If you all read Simon's post from this past week, like, yeah, man, I'm right there with you, except I do still use Amazon. I'm sorry. So we also have algorithms, an issue with algorithms. And I guess this would be one example of how they use data to nudge us a certain way. There are certain algorithms in place that if they know something about you, they can then show you something that'll make you go towards a direction that they want you to go to. So for example, this is like an example from like Netflix, I think, where, if you are into serendipity, eternal sunshine of a spotless mind, and while you were sleeping, Netflix will say, hey, you might be into Good Will Hunting, because it's about like, this love story and everything, and it's got basically these two white characters who are in love with each other, so it's a good movie for you. But if you're into Arrested Development and Zoolander and Anger Management, which are comedies, you might like Good Will Hunting also, because it's got Robin Williams, who's a comedian, and all that stuff. And it ends up recommending the same movie to two very different pathways, right? And it's sort of steering us towards certain things. I think part of the issue with that, for me, is that certain media that's out there gains popularity in sort of an inflated way. I don't know if that makes sense. You can see this on YouTube too, right? Where like once someone hits like maybe 10,000 or 20,000 followers, their videos and their channel is going to be recommended way more often than somebody who hasn't hit that criteria yet. And then from there, it just sort of snowballs. And so once you hit like a certain amount of thousands, it's then much easier to get like millions of followers and everything. And a lot of it's just this like popularity sort of algorithm thing that exists. And it's kind of like contrary to YouTube's purpose or original purpose. I mean, obviously YouTube basically exists to make money now, but originally YouTube was created so that anyone could upload anything, and we would all share videos with each other and everything, right? But that's not really the main thing that's going on YouTube now. I mean, still, each of us can still create an account and share our videos with each other, right? Like you can still do that, but in order to become like popular or to have YouTube actually recommend your stuff, it's all about money. You know, and same thing with Netflix and everything. So this leads to this idea that from the McKinsey work reading that we are actually NPCs in some sort of metagame. And work references this Philip K. Dick novel, The Game Players of Titan, where the Vugs are controlling humans. The Vugs who live on Titan are controlling humans, and the humans are basically just pieces of data for them, right? Or pieces of pawns in some sort of game that they can move around. And this chessboard analogy, I guess, is deliberate, right? We're pawns. And so for companies like YouTube, Google, Netflix, Amazon, Facebook, and everything, each individual one of us is just like a little blip in their whole network of data. And they make money by moving millions of blips at the same time. And so we don't really matter for them, other than the fact that our aggregate matters for them. And so, they are in the business basically of moving us around and making money off of our movements and everything. Which is just, I don't know, it's kind of terrible. And it's really sad when you realize this. But then what Work was arguing was that it's actually even sadder than that. Like what's actually happening is all these companies are doing this because we live in this ultra capitalist system where even if the companies became super ethical, or became super like focused on humanity, their hands would still be tied because they're in this capitalist system where they're actually beholden to stockholders and shareholders and stuff, right? Where they actually cannot make ethical decisions because because the bottom line is the most important thing in this system that we're all in, that they're in. So we're in this meta game where they're controlling us, but they themselves are in a meta game where basically the system is controlling them, right? And then a layer above that, the meta game or whatever, you know, we have this capitalist system that we sort of imposed upon ourselves. Um, but ultimately the earth has limited resources, and we're hitting that constraint very, very quickly. It may be too late already. You know, a whole bunch of people are going to be affected by climate change in the next 20 years, and um, we really only have ourselves to blame, right? Um, so that's the state of affairs. It's pretty depressing. Um, let's talk about potential solutions. Um, some of the readings had glimmers of hope, I think. One of them was this one by Heather Alexandra about how games, understanding games and making meaning in games, a lot of it happens in your head. And you make connections between what's going on in the game and your own life. You make connections between your understanding of a particular genre of games or whatever, a particular genre of story. Um, you like, we just do this naturally, patterns and everything, and we make connections between everything. That's how we understand ourselves and each other, right? Is um, living through various events and experiences, and then use that as a guideline for how to act in the world, how to be in the world, right? So games are very similar to, in the sense that games sort of necessarily are abstractions, because they're meant to be simulate, can't be perfect simulations, and so they have to take a lot of shortcuts, and we fill in all these sort of blanks ourselves. And the reason why I think the glimmer of hope is that, like, I feel like um, there's still room for player agency. There's still room for us to be making meaningful connections in a way that isn't, that may be really like free of manipulation. Maybe they're not, but there's still the sense that we sort of are in control, at least locally, of our own story, at least a little bit. I have to hope. And so that's, I was hoping the meta text of it, I guess, of this article be about. This reading is no longer in the syllabus, but there used to be this reading about speculative fiction and speculative design. And if you're thinking of like going to an IMD program like that, you should read this book, Speculative Everything. It's basically about thinking about potential futures and possible futures and everything, and trying to break away from constraints of the current day and think about, like, don't just design something like the next iPhone because that's what's existed for a decade now. Think about something that's just completely radically different, that represents an idealistic world that you would want to live in, and design for those things, and then work backwards from that and try to introduce things that we are nudged towards a promising future rather than just a money-making future, right, or a devastating future. Um, it also ties into a whole bunch of other things. So if you're interested in like Afrofuturism, or like from Black Panther, or if you're interested in like indigenous futures or whatever, like, this is a good book to read. We did read the book. So learning and identity in games, basically, right? From this chapter, from this book, video games have to teach us about learning and literacy. This book actually when in 2003 this book came out, and game Knights of the Old Republic also came out, which is it's a Star Wars themed role-playing game. I played that game and read this book sort of at the same time, and that's what made me become a PhD student, because I realized that there's a lot about games that could be used for good, basically for education and good and everything, and that this exploration of morality and ethical reasoning gameplay, that was worthwhile to explore and everything. But anyway, so this chapter about Bede where like, James G is talking about these three different identities that go on as playing this game. Where he's constrained by himself, constrained by what Bede can do, and he's also constrained by this future projection of who he thinks Bede should be, right? So, and that's this projected identity, and it's super strong. Like, and he argues that, it's super strong of a concept, I guess. Different people, it has different strengths. Like some people don't play games this way, but he argues that we should be like modeling classrooms in this way, where we're getting kids to feel like, to like actually visualize themselves as like, a NASA scientist or something like that, and then make decisions in class as if they were this NASA scientist, so that they are moving towards this projected version of themselves, idealized version of themselves that's like better than are now, right? And if you think about it, you could apply this thing, right? Like, just live life this way. There's a better version of you tomorrow than there is today, and if you make decisions today, you can get there tomorrow, right? And a lot about, I think about just recognizing that you are in society, and that you're not just by yourself, and that the decisions you make have an effect on everyone around you and the world, and use that to guide. Like, if that's true, then think about how you want the world to be, and how you want your friends to be, or your loved ones to be in the future, and work towards that, right? And if you use that to guide your decisions and everything, then you live, a um, consistent life, thought and action, right? Which is what Socrates is all about. And if you haven't read Socrates, you should read Socrates. He's all about like using logical reasoning to think through the decisions that you make in life, and if every action that you do is actually aligned with your beliefs. But so, so taking these identities, like like thinking about a better version of the future and your place in that future, and then how you become that person and how the future becomes that future, right? Is really about what these three identities are about for me. Okay, so the actual reading for this week. This book is another attempt, I guess, for me to impart upon you a potential way of being, so that the world is better. And like this whole class is, secretly, I guess not secretly, but secretly until you're actually enrolled in the class, me proselytizing a way of living so that you make the world better, so that I can feel good about myself because I feel good about you. So this is another of those attempts. So this guy named Bernie DeKoven wrote this book in, I think, the late 70s. It was published in like 1978 or something like that, and then it was republished just a few years ago, like 2013 or 2015 or something like that. And then I was asked to write a review for the book when it was republished. So I review books for this journal called the American Journal of Play. So there's several books that I reviewed for them, and when this book came out, they wanted me to review this for them. I have no idea how they got the name originally. I don't know how I started reviewing for them, but anyways, I'm really happy that they asked me to review this, because this book basically changed my life. Like, I guess I'll just get into it. So, all right, what is a well-played game? Well, let's start with Bernie DeKoven. He is this guy who, or was this guy, I guess. He passed away recently. In the 80s, he sort of was one of the spearheads for this movement called the New Games movement. And it kind of was spawned from the 60s and 70s. And if you remember, like, we had the Xanadu stuff, where like Ted Nelson is totally like this idealist from the 70s, right? Who's like this, like, he believes technology will save the world and everything. I don't think he believes this anymore, honestly, right? Because you can see that he's super cynical nowadays, which is really sad. But back then, in the 70s, there were a whole bunch of people who thought like technology would save the world. Well, and some of it's kind of like hippie commune thinking, right? And so Bernie DeKoven is also of that ilk, except he thought that games and play would save the world. And so he and a bunch of other people were doing this thing called New Games Movement, which is basically like trying to hold workshops and visit schools and companies and stuff and do this like training and everything to try to get more people to be more playful in their everyday lives. And the reason why this is important is because of Bernie's understanding of play, in that it only counts if everyone involved is included. And so he really thought that this was like a way to get everyone to love and understand each other, right? So this New Games movement, like, he in northeastern Pennsylvania, he used to run this farm or a ranch or whatever, and it was basically a commune, and you could go and visit them, and he had this barn that was basically full of games, like board games and like playground games, and he had like there's this one, I don't even know what it's like. I don't know if I would call it a game, but it's like this world ball. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but a beach ball, right? It's like this massive ball that you throw around on a beach, right? But a world ball is like that, except it's like massive, massive. It's like 20 feet in diameter at least. And it requires a lot of people to hit it at the same time in order for it to sort of bounce up into the air and everything. So think about a bunch of people getting together, like out in a farm field, and like bouncing this ball up in the air and just seeing how often they can keep it up in the air, right? And that suddenly has become a game, right? And you can think about, like, you do that, like, you've done that as a kid, right? Bouncing a hacky sack up and down or something like, or hitting an air balloon up, right? Like on someone's birthday or whatever, just trying to balloon up in the air for as long as. So like, think of that like in this like a much bigger scale. Those are games that Bernie was into. So he wanted like so games like Red Rock, right? Or like freeze tag and stuff like that. These, like, I guess you could call them playground games. But what's interesting about playground games is that, like, the rules can change like crazy. Like, anyone can just say, no, we're just going to play this, and everyone's cool with it, right? And like it's not like the rules of the game are the important part. The important part is that everyone who's in the playground is actually just having fun, right? That's what Bernie was all about and everything. So I'm gonna play this video, and this will be like a really quick introduction to the book. And it's working.
That's my book in the earliest incarnation. You will notice that there are people of multi-hued all pulling on the same side in the cover. Multi-hued people. There's no persons of limited ability or other kinds of hues of life, but this was, in 1978, this was a very big way of demonstrating that play is something that can bring people together, that can create community out of strangers, because it's a universally shared experience. So I was very interested in this idea that there was such a thing as a well-played game. That people would actually say to each other, oh, that game was really well played. Because it was referring to an aesthetic of the play experience that is beyond the idea of winning and losing, which is where most discussions tend to stop when you're talking about playing a game. Oh, Daddy, I played baseball today. Did you win? And that's the end of the conversation, you know. If you say, I didn't win, oh, I'm so sorry. Try harder next time. But the fact is that what really, I believe, what really draws people to a game, to wanting to play a game, is the idea of playing together. And when you play together, and you play together so well that you can look back at each other and say, oh, wasn't that a well-played game? Or, wasn't that fun? Which is kind of an easier way of saying the same thing. It means that you've stepped outside of the frame of the game and you've evaluated and become and shared the experience that you had together, that you created together, which is just like what was going on with our little digital game that we played. You know, it was fun, but the fun was created together, and you shared that, and you can evaluate that together as an experience that you've built and shared. And oddly enough, as simple as that idea is, it still remains very revolutionary.
So that probably is the gist of it, that everyone who's playing the game is getting, I guess, an enjoyable experience out of it, right? So there's some quotes that I want to highlight that these are things that I highlighted in the review that I wrote. So DeKoven says on page 57, the only thing that makes a game real is that there are people playing. This for me ties to, you know, the Alexandra reading, and also like thinking about making connections in games as you're playing a game. A lot of it, like, in order to make those connections in a game, requires for the game to be happening. And so for me, game is more about verbs than it is nouns, and it's really about narration that's happening, and an instantiation of, you know, the rules and the play space and the people who are in it and the decisions that they make, um, all are part of an instantiation of the game. So no two games are actually the same, right? So it's real. It's real when it becomes instantiated and is happening in the moment. Right? Another thing he wrote, this is page 5, so it's pretty early on. Our success in the search for the well-played game can only be measured in terms of how well we have been able to play together. Either we achieve it or we don't achieve it at all. It is measured by the score. It is not measured by the game. It is measured by those of us playing it. Was one of you actually highlighted in the Canvas questions? Like, yeah, exactly. This is the main point. Is that the people who are involved in playing the game are matter. Ultimately, the rules don't matter unless all the people involved agree that they matter. You know, and so the rules can be bent if all the people involved negotiate that and think that the rules should be in order to make the play space better. And it's really about inclusion and like making sure that everyone is getting out of it, right? So then I started writing a summary of that in my review. So I wrote, the search for the well-played game is really search for a stable, safe community of play. What does that mean? So what's a play community? So there's game communities and there's play communities. A game community is when people are focused on establishing rules and those rules of a game and trying to make it fair and everything, right? And trying to make it so that usually they're competitive, so that when you achieve certain things in the game, it's done in a fair manner. You don't have an advantage over somebody else because the rules are static. So think of like professional sports. Um, you know, if you watch a football game, there's a whole bunch of refs everywhere. Soccer game, there's a whole bunch of refs everywhere. Um, and they're there to make sure that the players are following all the rules of the game and everything. And there's always in every game there's always um, controversy, as certain people kind of bend the rules or sort of unsportsmanlike or whatever. Um, and the whole tournament setup and all that stuff is set up so that there's all these rule structures in place and everyone sort of adheres by them. And when you have a game against another team, you don't really care how well that team does, so long as you do better than them. Um, and that's in contrast to a play community where you want the opponent to have as good a time as you are having, and no matter who wins. You know what I mean? And so then the focus is on the players, not the game itself, which means that the rules can be bent, can be broken, they can be, you can introduce handicap certain players to make it interesting. Or it's a lighter affair, right? It's more like it's more laid back, right? And I think that's the kind of thing that DeKoven was trying to push. Not game communities, but play communities. So, and I also wrote, they're not all able to find a stable play community, however, right? Not everyone can search for a well-played game. It's a privilege that some of us can, and it is our responsibility to ensure that everyone can, that more of us can, right? So this is something that DeKoven doesn't address at all, where I think that, talk this idealized version of like how to live your life and like how to be inclusive and all that stuff is all great and everything, but it's really hard to actually do in practice, because all of us are coming from different backgrounds and everything, and some of us um, come from much more disadvantaged backgrounds than others of us, right? And there isn't really even a room for somebody to even think about life in this way, right? Like they're just trying to survive. And so that's one of the main issues, I think, that's sort of preventing movement towards like this sort of vision of like how the world could be for that DeKoven had. I also wrote, okay, so but to back up, so by writing about how games become well played and how we collectively search for them, DeKoven is actually describing for us how to care about each other. I think that's really what it is. Like this is really a hippie, and he really loves people. He wants everyone basically to love each other. And his search for excellence in all of us and for maximizing bliss for everyone as a collective. The never-ending search for a well-played game is really a never-ending search for how to be good to yourself and to others. I actually met him at a couple conferences and everything, and I told him, or he what's funny is I wrote that review and then he tweeted me, um and like I hadn't met him before, so he found my Twitter account and then tweeted at me and was like, did you write? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, good job, right? So it's pretty awesome. And then I met him at a couple conferences and stuff. He's pretty awesome. Before he died, he was really prolific, of a blogger. Like, so he created videos and he posted his website often. And I want to play for you one of the last videos that he created. I hope it works.
Playful people have more fun. They do. Playful people see fun everywhere. They see the invitation, the opportunity. They see it in animals and children, in the play of a falling leaf, the changing shape of a cloud, dancing bees, the infinite variety of blossoms, the shifting winds, the sparkles in a wind-rippled puddle. So why is it that some of us seem playful and some of us not, when all of life plays? I used to think that playful people are playful by choice, but that isn't the choice that they make. All of nature is playful, and we are all playful by nature. To play is not the choice. The choice they make is not to play. And we make that choice because of the way so many others of us have made theirs. Because so many weigh us down with the busyness, with isolation, uncertainty, mistrust. And living among all those people who have chosen not to be playful, people bowed by the sheer somber weight of their choice, it worries away at all of us. It brings about doubt until we also choose against play. But the whole of life is in play, all of it. And people choosing not to play is in some deep way choosing death. It's denying life until sometimes before the end of their numbered days, their numbing bodies bathed in the laughing light, they wonder again at last, once again, they wonder.
So these are my questions. What is the potential played approach to games and life in general? And what can we take from it to help with our individual and our communal crises? And what do you think of the through line for the course, which is agency and whether we have it? Does it make sense? What are your thoughts on it? And, RIP.